apologize for the delay. Okay, we're recording, we're in. We are not going to do the 1 minute of meditation. We are so behind schedule. Let me make sure that everybody's coming in. Devin, I'm so sorry I drove you crazy. I couldn't get in. All right. Welcome, everyone. I am Huri Gedelekian, Chair of NGO CSW. Thank you all for being here. Apologies for the delay. Usually we're on top of these things. We're going to have a really busy program and we're already a few minutes behind. So let me update you quickly on UN Women. Some of you who are ECOSOC accredited were at the Bureau Chair briefing this morning, which was amazing. I am so excited with the Bureau this year. They are very civil society friendly and they're really trying their best to be inclusive. Unfortunately, because of COVID, CSW 66 will be a hybrid, meaning some member states and the meetings will be in person, but it will not be available for civil society as in the past, right? So we are doing our best to make sure that your voices are brought in. And of course, you're going to hear a lot about our virtual forum from our co-chairs in a minute. There's a lot of activities. There's a lot of new ways of engaging that we're working on. So please stay tuned, follow us on social media, definitely look at our newsletters and MailChimps. There's so much information coming out from our office soon. And you can see, well, I'm not going to say anything about the forum because the co-chairs will tell you. So I'm going to right now just pass it on to our forum co-chairs. And then we also have a special guest here from UN Women, Rita, who's a dear friend and does amazing work with young girls. So she will have a few minutes to update us on what's happening in her team. But Rosa and Pam, the floor is yours. Please update us on what's happening with our virtual forum. Thank you.
Rosa, do you want to start with parallel events? Rosa may not be here yet, so I'll start with conversation circles. The subcommittee on conversation circles led by Terry Jensen Mabel is moving along brilliantly. They have 12 conversation circles that are under consideration: sexual and reproductive health and rights, anti-racism, peace and security, LGBTQI, mental health, violence against women, impact of migration, including human trafficking, the future of education, feminist and youth movements and leadership, economic justice and rights, indigenous women, and the working group on girls, all within the subtext of climate change, the environment, and disaster risk reduction. So Terry and Mabel are in the process of firming up moderators, at least 2 for each of these conversation circles. And if you remember from last year, the conversation circles were one of the most popular parts of the NGO CSW 65 forum. So we're really looking forward to seeing how we're able to shape this and move it into an exciting part of the forum. The next thing that I'd like to speak about is the booths, the exhibit booths. And we encourage you to please apply for one. There are a host of things you can do in the exhibit booths. Your organization can conduct interviews. You can have social events. You can have a dance party. You can play games, or you can have networking. You can have many organizational retreats. There are a host of reasons why your organization would do very well to purchase a exhibit booth for the NGO CSW 66 forum. And the application is right on our website, www.ngocsw.org. So those are 2 very important aspects. If Rosa is not here, I'll just briefly talk about the parallel events. Rosa? No. Okay, the parallel event applications end tomorrow. So if your organization is on the fence or you're not sure, please put in your application for a parallel event. They're only $125 and your reach can be enormous. You can help women in the regions learn more about your good practices. And that's what it's all about, helping each other. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Hootie.
Thank you so much, Pam. That was an excellent update. And the most important news, I can't wait to share with you all that our portal is now open. So we're going to share the link so that you can all sign up for free. We actually bought even more space this year so that we can host more people. You can start signing up and start exploring what we're calling the portal. And like I said in the chat, please, I will read all the questions and answer you one by one. We are here to help facilitate this as much as possible. And now I am going to go to Rita from UN Women to update us on the work that she's doing.
Okay, thank you very much, Huri. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to see the diversity of people in the room. So excited to be here. I'm Rita Miambo, as indicated by Huri. I'm with the Civil Society Division and managing the youth and faith portfolios within UN Women. So I think in terms of youth engagement in CSW, I think we've been pushing a lot to ensure that young people are seen, they've got a voice around CSW. And I'm really glad to say we've made some milestones as we have been going through this process. We also want to ensure that we open spaces for adolescents. So the update I'm going to give is around the youth engagement, but also adolescents. In terms of the youth engagement, we are embarking on a different process this year, or next year, in terms of ensuring that the recommendations that are going to come from the youth are actually taken into consideration. So there are going to be regional consultations for youth that will take place in the month of January, where the youth in different regions are going to come up with recommendations that will feed into the youth forum that will take place from the 3rd to the 4th of March. But before that, we want to ensure that the recommendations that are coming from the regions are also shared with the chair of CSW so that they can inform some of the conversations that will be happening during CSW. We're quite excited because in the briefing this morning, the chair actually referred to the regional conversations, referred to the recommendations that are going to come from the youth. So for us, that's a really, it's quite historic for her to indicate that they will be important. So after the youth forum that will take place end of February, we're going to have an intergenerational dialogue during CSW on the 17th of March. We are working very closely with the Action Coalition on Climate so that our key messages are the same as we go into this process. So with regards to adolescents, I think, as you know, in each of the action coalitions, there is a targeted action for adolescents. So we are in the process of putting together an adolescents advisory body that will be that will play a role of monitoring the implementation of the Action Coalition actions and everything else that goes there. This body will also have a role of advising UN Women on how to work with adolescents. So the nomination, the call for nominations will go out in January. The selection will also take place in February. And then we will announce that advisory body that will be there for the next 2 years before we select the new body until the end of the Action Coalitions in 2026. We understand as well that there are government regional consultations that are taking place in January. For the LAC region, it's from the 25th to the 27th of January. For the Arab region, it's the 30th of January. For ECA, it will be on the 15th of February, and all the other dates will be coming in. Thank you very much. Back to you, Huri.
Thank you, Rita. That was a lot of information, and perhaps you can send us your notes so that we can share it with the group, with our minutes and our recording. And again, since we kind of started off with some tech issues, I am going to thank you so much, Rita. You are amazing, and your voice to bring in girls and adolescent is just so important. Please, everyone, mute yourselves. I am going to quickly go over everything that was said because so many people are joining in late. I am going to repeat by saying that official CSW 66 will be hybrid. So member states will gather to meet for the opening, closing, and negotiations. They are not encouraging civil society from anywhere in the world to travel to New York City. All side events, official side events on the UN Women and member state side will be virtual. And of course, all of this information will be shared in our NGO CSW newsletter. It will be posted on our social media and on our website, where you can click on NGO CSW 66 forum, and all of this information will be uploaded as we get them. Now, thank you, Devin, for that official. Also, we NGO Committee on the Status of Women are 100% virtual. The platform is now open for registration. We have enlarged the capacity and we can accommodate up to 40,000 people. So tell your friends who want to learn about what's happening on the global level. We know that climate is an important topic, so people will want to come in here. Our parallel event applications, which is also virtual, was extended until tomorrow evening, New York time. So you have another at least 24 hours to submit your parallel events, and then we will have to close so that we have an opportunity to vet them and also upload them. And as Pamela said, there's other opportunities for you to engage on the platform. None of that is urgent, so I'm not even going to repeat it. Like exhibit booth obviously is a great one. You can go and check it out, but you know, we'll address those in January. And our subcommittees, the global subcommittees, are working on some amazing opportunities for conversations. Pam also mentioned the conversation circles. So I just wanted to briefly kind of give a synopsis because so many people entered after we gave our updates. I will continue checking our chat box and giving you, and answering your questions. So any specific questions to Rita before we let her go? Raise your hand and I'll look and see if you have. Okay. It says, Claudia, would you like to unmute yourself? And this is specific for Rita before she leaves.
Yes, sorry. So my question is actually, so if CSO is not attending, then member states are surely provided with diet. So I wanted to ask, because if the theme is like related to climate change, I wanted to ask if there is like specific diet that will be plant-based, since it's like very, like it's one of the strategies to reduce carbon footprint of the event. So I just wanted to ask if CSW is considering moving to plant-based diet in the venue.
Okay, that's an interesting question. It's definitely not for Rita, but good for you for raising your hand. I definitely, no, seriously, I'm very happy you took the mic. I always like to give the mic to young people, so I'm glad you asked that question. And we will bring that actually to CSW. That question has not come up in our circles. Plant-based diet. Everybody hear that? We're bringing that. So on that note, I can also say that the good news is that this chair, as I said earlier, is very much civil society friendly. And as Rita said, she is not only looking for regionals and different groups for recommendations, she has accepted our recommendations. We have an amazing group of advisory, advocacy and research group. Susan is here. We can post actually our recommendations in the chat so that you can see. We've shared it already publicly. They are all considering our recommendations that came from global consultations, right? This was done with all experts in each regions, and we brought them together to bring to the chair, to Secretary General, to UN Women, and to the Bureau and member states as well. So the good news is that even though it's hybrid and even though civil society is not going to be present in the negotiations, they are definitely open to listening to our recommendations. There will be opportunities for civil society to speak at CSW. Those applications or those calls for actions also will go out later in the early next year. So keep an eye on everything that we're doing with our newsletters and information, and then you can apply to speak at, if you're ECOSOC accredited, obviously. Beth, I'm going to give you the floor, and then we can say goodbye to Rita. Is it a question for Rita?
Yes, yes,
I
it
thought
is.
so. Beth from Working Group on Girls, go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Rita, for your great work and especially your collaboration with Working Group on Girls as we head towards journey towards CSW this year. I know in the past, sometimes both UN Women and sometimes the Bureau have had like 1 day or half day or even couple hour sessions for civil society specifically. You may have mentioned that and I may have missed it because you had such a wealth of information to share with us. But do you anticipate any of that coming up in either January or February as yet another way for us to get our voice in there? And happy to hear any helpful hints from you about other additional ways we could get our voice heard.
Unfortunately, Beth, I wouldn't be able to tell you an answer right now. I think it's also conferring with the rest of the house in terms of what's coming up, especially with Johannes. And we'll definitely be giving that information to Huri to share with everyone. But I'm sure there will be opportunities because of the hybrid nature and that civil society are not going to be, to be there. We're going to try and find other opportunities where civil society can engage before CSW.
Thank you so much.
That is absolutely true. Thank you, Rita. And I can confirm that because this came up this morning as well, that we want some opportunities to engage even before CSW so that they're prepared with our recommendations from all constituents. Rita, you're welcome to stay with us, but thank you so much for taking the time to come and update us. We always love to hear from UN Women, especially our civil society section that we work so closely with. And we'll see you early next year. Have a great holiday season. There's 3 minutes before our program starts. I can easily give the floor to our fantastic organizer this month, who's Margarita. But I just want to take 1 minute because Rosa had a hard time getting in and she's in. If Rosa and Pamela want to take a minute to add anything that I forgot or you want to just acknowledge. And then we're going to do a very quick poll before I hand the floor to Margarita to start the program. Rosa, Pamela, anything we need to add?
Thank you, Huri. Oh, go ahead, Pamela.
No, go ahead, Rosa.
Along really, we're both so gracious. So I want to first everyone who's here today to show support for everything that the CSWNY is doing. We are working so hard to plan a fantastic NGO forum. I know it's been put out there, but the reminder that tomorrow is the deadline for a event and that registration is open. And it's really about showing your commitment to feminism, the memory of Bell Hooks, and quote her in very short line, which is for everybody. So in that spirit, I will hand over to Pamela.
Thank you, Rosa. We actually are out of time, but you were getting cut off a little bit. So please put the quote in the chat so that everybody, that sounded like a quote I know, and I want everybody to see it. You were breaking up a little bit. Pamela, you're okay, right?
Yeah, I just want to remind people to please check with the NGO CSWs in their regions, because there are lots of opportunities to participate leading up to NGO CSW. Thank you.
All right, now we're going to do a very quick poll, and then Margarita, get ready to take over with your fantastic program. And of course, Devin is doing 50,000 things at a time, just so that you know. There it is. Are you new to CSW? We'll give it another 30 seconds. Fantastic. Well, this is quite interesting that we have 30% new members. So a lot of you will have lots of questions. And honestly, it is a lot of information. I just got another message who wants to learn more about CSW. We do have training sessions coming up with YLYP. Keep your eyes open on that. We do not have the capacity to do one-on-one training, unfortunately, but we work very hard. We, as you know, 99% of this organization are volunteers. Terry, Pam, Rosa, myself, we're all putting this forum together to accommodate your needs. So it is 1:30 exact, and Margarita, the floor is yours. Thank you for organizing such an amazing panel discussion, and I can't wait to learn more about human rights, children's rights, and CEDAW.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Margarita Jones, representing Humanists International, and a member of, obviously, the executive committee of the NGO CSW and the co-chair of the NGO Committee on Children's Rights. It is really a pleasure to see so many people attending our meeting. In terms of my overall method right now, I'm basically addressing it to actually the 31% that most likely does not know a lot about how conventions work. So the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, are two of the most ratified United Nations conventions. CEDAW by 189 state parties and the CRC by 196 state parties. CEDAW was adopted in 1979, so this gives you a time frame of how long these conventions have been around, and entered into force on September 3rd, 1981. The CRC was adopted on November 20th, 1989, and entered into force September 2, 1990. Once ratified by a country, both conventions demand regular reports from governments to their respective UN treaty committees. These treaty committees monitor implementation and voice recommendations and concerns in their concluding remarks. Civil society and NGOs can have input by submitting a shadow report to the UN Treaty Committee, which is taken very seriously by those committees. A shadow report can highlight issues not raised by their government or point out where the government may have been misleading the committee from the real situation. The CRC, however, does not use the description of shadow reports. Instead, it uses alternative reports. These are submitted by an organization or individual which is independent from the country's government. So CEDAW in general gets more worldwide attention than the CRC, especially after the 4th World Conference on Women in 1995 in Beijing, when women's rights are human rights became a popular rallying cry. So my question kind of is, could children's rights are human rights follow? The present dialogue is centered around how these two conventions can reinforce each other's strength and point out some challenges for cooperation. We are extremely fortunate to have 3 experts with us, sharing some of their insights, research, and practical applications for these 2 treaties to make a difference in people's lives. In the interest of time, I'm only mentioning a few of their accomplishments, so please read their bios. Alda Facio is a Costa Rican feminist jurist, writer, teacher, and international expert in gender and human rights in Latin America. She is one of the founding members of the Women's Caucus for Gender Justice at the International Criminal Court. Since 2014, she has been one of the 5 United Nations Special Rapporteurs for the Working Group Against Discrimination Against Women and Girls. Jonathan Todres is a professor of law at Georgia State University of Law. His research is on children's rights and child well-being. He focuses on the implementation of children's rights law, child trafficking, and other forms of child exploitation, human rights education, and human rights and social determinants of health. He is co-author of Human Rights in Children's Literature, Imagination and the Narrative of Law. Ranjita de Silva de Alves is Assistant Dean of International Affairs at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where she teaches international women's rights and the Policy Lab, including the Policy Lab on AI, artificial intelligence, and bias. She serves on the UN Women High-Level Working Group on Women's Access to Justice and as advisor to gender equality at UNESCO. She is a non-resident senior fellow at Harvard Law School, at Harvard Law School Center on the Legal Profession, where she is co-authoring a study on the transformative impact of business, leadership, innovation, and inclusion on accelerating the SDGs, the Social Development Goals. All right, this will include my reading of my whatever. And I'm gonna now give the floor to Alda Facio. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm very honored and pleased to have been invited to this panel and hope. Can you hear me? Yes. Somebody's telling me that I am. Okay. I did.
Yeah, you're absolutely
you
fine.
ask-
You're absolutely fine. Go ahead.
And I didn't hear the question though. I wasn't able to hear the question. It was breaking up.
Margarita, you have the floor.
Is it the first question? Yeah.
Well, you can answer the first question. I didn't post the question because I thought you all had something to start off with, and then I jumping at the question. But we can do it that way too, no problem. Would you? I can do the question. All right. Let's see.
Whatever is. I mean, it is a very interesting question. So I thought that we would start with that. But I just wanted to say that children's rights are human rights. There's no question. And in 1993, with the World Conference on Human Rights, that's when women became human and children also. It was in both chapters were declared that children's rights are human rights and women's rights are human rights. So there's no question about that. And I was asked to talk about what opportunities do we see in collaboration with both rights, the children's rights and or the girls' rights and the women's rights. And in fact, there's so many that I won't be able to talk about all of them, but of course there has been already, in fact, the working group where I was a member, which is the 5 special rapporteurs from the Human Rights Council. Our name was the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women. And in 2014, we were able to change the name to the working group on discrimination against women and girls to make it clear. I think it was, or maybe 2015, but anyway, it was to make it clear that when we're talking about women, even we're also talking about the girl, right? But sort of to have the name there. And we have always, when in all our reports and everything, we have always, with country visits, et cetera, as I will share with you later on, we talk about the girl situation, the discrimination against girls, and how this starts the discrimination against females, to say that from all ages, starts at the beginning, from the very, even sometimes before birth. So of course there's a lot of collaboration that we have to do, so that the CRC, which is the committee that monitors the Convention on the Rights of the Children, and the CEDAW committee work together in many issues to make sure that the child is not discriminated and can grow up to be a full human when she grows up. I think I'll stop there. I have concrete examples of collaboration that have been done between the two committees that monitor, as Margareta was saying, that monitor both conventions. But I also have some examples of what the working group has done with trying to combine those two different forms of rights.
All right, would you just, yeah. Who was trying to come in? I'm not sure. Would you like to just go on and explain? Because I had the first question was, in your work, can you please share a current example that cuts across both CEDAW and CRC? That's so, we'll just do it that way so that you can continue. Yeah.
Okay, yes. Well, one that comes to the front immediately is violence against the girls and women in the family, or what we call domestic violence, or what Jean and Linda would call a non-state torture. What happens within the walls of the home or the family, etc. That is something that the girls and women experience so much of, and especially with the COVID, we learned that there was an increase in violence against women and girls. And so that is one thing that really is cross-cutting, and that the Committee on Children's Rights and the Committee on CEDAW really work hard to visibilize and to try to eradicate. And another one, of course, is that I think Jonathan will talk about is trafficking, which is, there's even a special rapporteur on trafficking in women and in people, and then especially women and girls. So that brings about, and another, of course, is the lack of education or lack of access to education, and then lack of education both to girls, but then even as adults, women still have harder time to access education, or what is called adult education. So it is those three issues which are very important. But discrimination, again, of course, girls suffer discrimination from the moment they're born, and continue to suffer discrimination through their adult life. And then as older women, as an example of myself, we suffer different kinds of discrimination as you get older, but you still keep suffering discrimination. It goes through the whole cycle of life. So those issues are cross-cutting.
Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, you can write it in the chat. And now I will give the floor to Jonathan Todres.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for attending today. I know we all have busy schedules, and giving up some of that time to be together is both important, but it also is a sacrifice. So I appreciate that you're making time today. And Margarita, and to the NGO CSW, I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. What I'm interested in, just very briefly, is I focus on children's rights, so I guess I'm sort of the children's rights representative on this call today. But I focus on children's rights, and what I'm interested in doing through law and policy primarily, but also through the implementation of law and policy, is elevating children. How do we elevate children? How do we reduce harm? How do we ensure that their rights are realized so that they can grow and develop to their full potential? That's my interest in the work that I do. And for a number of years, as many on at the meeting today, no doubt see, there are lots of opportunities for collaboration among children's rights and women's rights advocates. One thing that I find interesting, though, is we often talk about rights being interrelated and interdependent, but once we've said that, there's very little work, and too often what we end up seeing is the work is done in silos, and each human rights group in the UN system and even in individual countries is often very siloed. And I think there are of course examples of great collaborations, but many times we are operating just in our silo. And I think if we are going to realize the benefits of the multiple human rights regimes, then I think there's really a need for more collaboration. In my own view, there's multiple benefits. As Alda said, there's multiple benefits from a children's rights perspective as well. Women's rights provides direct benefits to girls, of course. The CEDAW framework can be used to address gender-based discrimination and violence. The CRC is actually silent on child marriage, one of the few areas that's really lacking in the CRC. But CEDAW, of course, has Article 16 and addresses child marriage. There's also indirect benefits. We know, although there's been progress made towards shared responsibility for child rearing, we know globally among men and women, the burden still disproportionately falls to women. And when women's rights are threatened, that puts children in jeopardy. When women can't secure their education rights, their labor rights, access to microfinance, and the result, it puts the whole family at risk in ways that are really important for children. And conversely, when women's rights are realized, there's good evidence that that has benefits for children as well. But there's children's rights benefits for women's rights as well. And I think although children's rights are more recent in their development, with the CRC only being adopted in 1989, I think really children's rights are foundational to all human rights. And I emphasize this point because too often children's rights are, similar to women's rights, are often marginalized. But if you do not believe in children's rights, then what you are saying is, what one is saying if they dismiss children's rights, is they are saying human rights are these things that governments grant to you when you turn 18 years old. And that is exactly the opposite of what human rights are. If we believe human rights are inherent in every individual, then they exist from the beginning, from birth. And so children's rights are really the foundation of human rights. Adults who have not had the experience of realizing their education rights, their health rights as children, won't be positioned to realize their rights as adults. And again, conversely, when health rights, education rights, and other rights of children are fulfilled, then they can grow into adults who can exercise their rights and stand up for the rights of others. So there's really wonderful opportunities here. I'll say briefly, we can talk more in the dialogue. I don't want to take too much time, but I've done a lot of work over the last 20 years on trafficking, mostly from a children's rights perspective, but also from a public health perspective. And my work has really focused on prevention. And when you talk about prevention, you have to talk about the root causes of the problem. Why is it some people, why is it some girls, some boys, some trans youth are more vulnerable to exploitation than others? We know poverty plays a role. We know lack of access to healthcare and disruptions in education, time on the street, child maltreatment in the home, racial discrimination, gender-based discrimination, and so many of the othering that occurs, the marginalization that occurs, so many of the answers for those of us working on children's rights are also found in CEDAW as a framework to really address the gender-based discrimination, the gender-based violence that underlies the sort of drivers of trafficking, particularly sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking. And that's not just in, that's in the, whether it's in the US or Thailand, two places that I've spent a lot of time working, very different in many ways, but the same othering, marginalization, and discrimination occurs in a way that puts young people, particularly girls, at risk of trafficking and other forms of exploitation. I'll stop there and I look forward to the rest of the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And hearing that children's rights are foundational makes me feel really wonderful. That to me is basically the essence of human rights. And somehow, how do you get this across to schools, to parents, to other adults, etc. So thank you so much. Now I give the floor to Ranjita. Your name is so long, I have to double check. Ranjita de Silva de Alves. Thank you so much for being part of this panel and dialogue. I know everybody is giving up a lot of your own personal time, so thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. My work focuses on mining the intersections of the CEDAW, the CRC, and the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But my work also lies at the intersection of the human rights treaties, as well as the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So I'm going to start by echoing some of what was said before in terms of channeling the spirit of the Vienna Declaration and Platform of Action in 1993, when it was reaffirmed that the human rights of women and the girl child are an inalienable, integral, and indivisible part of the human rights. And I am quoting from the platform of the Vienna Declaration. But I would like to add a fourth prism to that. And I would like to say that the human rights of women and the girl child are inextricably interlinked, apart from being inalienable and integral. So what I'm going to do is to start by doing a very quick textual analysis of the CEDAW and the CRC to look at the ways in which these values, as well as the principles, are complementary and mutually reinforcing. So the complementarities are very clear. The CRC in Article 24 recommends that states parties take effective and appropriate measures to abolish traditional practices prejudicial to children. And Article 5 of the CEDAW, which I think is a revolutionary provision, adopted in 1979, as Jonathan said, 10 years before the CRC was adopted, was something that really shifted the paradigm when it provided states, charged states to modify the social and cultural patterns of the conduct of men and women with a view to achieving the elimination of prejudices and customary practices, including stereotypes. So you see the ways in which the CEDAW and the CRC's fundamental values coincide and complement. But most of all, Article 9 of the CEDAW is central to children's rights. Article 9 of the CEDAW charges states parties to grant women equal rights with men with respect to the nationality of their children. Now, as we know, many states parties have unequal, asymmetrical provisions in terms of the ways in which women who marry foreigners women who marry outside of their nationalities are unable to pass on citizenship rights to their children, whereby children do not have access to education, healthcare, and other provisions that are entitled to citizens of that nation. Article 10, and we know that Article 10 is central once again and pivotal to the well-being of all children, because Article 10 of the CEDAW provides appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in their access to education. But it also provides, in a very nuanced manner, the elimination of any stereotype concepts of the role of men and women. So the stereotype concepts, those gender devaluation that takes place at infancy happens in educational institutions. So when the CEDAW provides the elimination of stereotypical concepts of the role of men and women at all levels and in all forms of education, and encouraging in particular revisions of textbooks and school programs and the adaptation of gender equal teaching methods, speaks heavily to advancing children's rights. And to me, given that the CRC is one of those fundamental provisions that calls for children's books, the publications of children's literature and children's books, and the adoption of that, reading that provision of the CRC with Article 10, which calls for the elimination of stereotype conduct and concepts, provides for children's literature education for all children to be gender neutral and to advance the equality of both genders in textbooks, curricula, school programming, after school programs, sports, as well as recreational opportunities. And then finally, what I think is so fundamental to the CEDAW and the CRC is Article 16 of the CEDAW. Article 16 of the CEDAW is probably the most contested of the provisions of the CEDAW because it calls for equality in the family. And the family is the locus of discrimination and the locus of unequal behavior and social patterns of conduct. And so when the CEDAW provides for equality in the family, it fundamentally creates equality in society by dismantling the public-private dichotomy. So the artificial dichotomy between the public and the private spaces are dismantled through Article 16, which calls for equality in the family. It pierces the veil of separation between the public and the private sector. So Article 16 calls for women and men to have the same rights to decide freely and responsibly on the number and spacing of their children, and to have access to the information, education, and means to enable them to exercise these rights. So that freedom of choice as to the number and spacing of their children speaks both to the inalienability of the rights of women and the well-being of children. Further, Article 16 calls for the same rights and responsibilities with regard to guardianship, wardship, trusteeship, and adoption of children, or similar institutions where those concepts exist. So once again, that equality in guardianship, wardship, trusteeship, as well as in equal responsibility in caregiving and responsibility in upbringing speaks both to gender equality in the family, but also the well-being of the child and the best interest of the child. And then finally, and Jonathan spoke to this, although the CRC is absent, the language on child marriage is absent from the CRC, and that is really a lacuna in the CRC. The CEDAW fills in that gap in 16.2 underscoring the fact that the betrothal and the marriage of a child shall have no legal effect, and all necessary action, including legislation, shall be taken to specify a minimum age for marriage and to make the registration of marriages in an official registry compulsory. So 3 things. It annuls child marriage. It calls for legislation that provides for a minimum age of marriage. And finally, it calls for the registration of marriage. Therefore, there is a record keeping of marriage. So this provision needs to be read with the CRC, because the CRC in Article 1 calls for that minimum age. In other words, it calls for age of 18 as the age of majority. So read together, we could assume that the minimum age of marriage is 18, the age of majority, because that is the cutoff point for adulthood. So read together, this is a force, an important force, and a weapon and a tool to address child marriage, forced marriage, and early marriage. And then finally, Article 18 of the CRC recognizes the common responsibilities of both parents for the upbringing and development of the child. And much thought, scholarship, programming, praxis has been spent on looking at gender equal caregiving responsibilities. And that caregiving, gender equal caregiving, and work-family reconciliation policies that are gender equal and are gender neutral are the bulwark, are the cornerstone, and the building blocks of gender equality. And the Sustainable Development Goals in Goal 5 makes clear that child marriage, that abolishing child marriage is a development issue, and work-family reconciliation policies along gender-neutral lines are a human rights issue, first and foremost, but it's also a macroeconomic issue. So I'm going to stop with that, and I will come back to more nuanced and more granular provisions of child marriage as enshrined in both the CEDAW and the CRC, and the ways they have been translated into normative provisions around the world. But I think having an idea of the normative framework and a textual analysis is important for us to create a framework for the complementarities of the CEDAW and the CRC.
Thank you so much for this incredible overview of, especially on child marriage and the CEDAW and CRC. It is really interesting that the CRC did not mention that at all. So yeah, but it does. I mean, the CRC also, like, for me, one of the issues there is, well, the military thing in terms of age 16. That was so that there was a slight distinction there in terms of personhood when you can go to the military, and you know, marriage wasn't mentioned there. But anyhow, so my next, I'm trying to figure this out, because in our outline we had said, like, can you have some actual stories or examples of your work, and any one of you can go first, you know, Jonathan, Alda, either way, or is fine. And then my next question would be, in just a sort of general, what challenges do you see in terms of developing closer connections? Because obviously you, or some of you already have close connections between the workings of CEDAW and CRC. Is there, you know, do you have any concrete examples where you could see that it really made a difference, this connection? I mean, yeah, so that's, go for whoever wants to go first. Alda, are you ready?
Yes, I can go. And one example that I can give is just the existence of the working group on discrimination against women and girls, because they really are, our mandate is to see the implementation of CEDAW and CRC and any other rights that pertain to women and girls in other conventions. So it's but our main convention is CEDAW and then CRC, and so that already is the connection. The working group is a special procedure of the Human Rights Council, and so the reports that we do to the Human Rights Council are sort of talking about the standards of human rights in the area that we're talking about. And so one example that I was thinking about is when we do country visits, official country visits, because it differs from CEDAW committee does not go to the countries, right? But the special rapporteurs can go visit officially to countries, and there we always would go to schools and to high schools and grammar and I don't know how to say it in English, the first schools that you go to, and then the high school and universities. We visit and talk to the children directly, to the girl child, and how they've been treated. Do they receive the same kind of education, et cetera, et cetera. So that was part of our work. But also, and one concrete example is when we visit prisons, and that is something that we haven't talked about today, is that in many countries, prisons where when women are put in prison, they're put in prison with their children, right? Or if they birth while they're in prison, the child is born in prison and stays in prison, and it's incredibly painful to hear like children in some of the prisons that I visited to say, I don't know what crime I committed, but I'm in prison, and so that is something that we have to really, it's hard to find a solution for this, because taking them out of prison means that they're taken out of their connection with their mothers, right? So it's not so easy, but I want to give a very good example that we did in one country that we were visiting, where we found that women and children were in the prison with adult men in the same prison, not even in different cells, but in the same prison. And we were told that they were sexually abused every day, all the time, by the adult males. And so we were able in that same visit to talk to authorities about this, and they were taken out of the prison and put in a separate building. So that is something that always warms my heart, to know that we were able to help these women and the children who were being sexually abused, and also not only sexually abused, but also abused with respect to food, because the adult males would steal the food that was given to the children to eat it themselves. So, and because they're stronger and bigger and all that. So we really have to make sure that children are not in the prison in prisons or in confined centers with adult males. That is one example, but we have several. We have one communication that I can talk about also. The communication are that civil society sends to us about a problem that they're facing, and we received many of these, and that's why I was talking about of violence in the family, and especially what is happening a lot lately is that the former husband or husband kills the child in order to get back at the spouse, right? And the problem in Spain, for example, is that even after the court knows that the man is violent and has been violent during the matrimony, and that is why there was a divorce, still they give custody to the father. Right. And so the father, when they have custody, it has happened a lot, is that they kill the child in order to get vengeance from the spouse, because they know that will be the most painful thing. And it's happened. We've received a lot of communications about that. And even in this one case where the mother is the one that went to prison and not the father who killed the child, because she tried to kidnap the child, so that he wouldn't kill the child, but he did anyway, and still she was sent to prison for breaking the law and taking the child away from Spain, right? So we receive this kind of information all the time, that mothers that are suffering because their children are being abused or even sexually abused, and cannot do anything because they have no rights. In many countries in the world, the women's voices are not heard, they're not believed, and so giving rights to women would make them be able to protect their children, and this is very important.
Thank you so much, and it's really sad to hear all those sad stories. Oh, somebody has got the. Please mute yourself, whoever it is. Thank you. All right. So, Jonathan and Ranjita, do you have anything to add from your side?
Sure. I'll say a few words. So I did see a couple of questions in the chat. One is on that asked that in CEDAW issues general recommendations. The CRC committee does the same. They call them general comments, but they do issue general comments. They have not issued one specifically on child marriage. In the reporting process, however, the committee frequently asks states parties about child marriage where relevant. So it's certainly an issue that the committee has tracked, though there isn't a general comment on the topic. There's another question about sort of the rights of older persons, and I think that goes to the broader sort of advancement of human rights. And I want to come back to that in a moment, but let me at least first touch upon the question that Margarita asked about challenges. When I think about challenges of collaborating among children's rights advocates and women's rights advocates, to me that there's both a conceptual challenge and then situational challenges. And the conceptual challenges is this, and that I think is important to talk about. We know that the phrase "the women and the children" historically was used to marginalize both groups. And so for those who are working on either children's rights or women's rights, and have concerns about that sort of grouping, I think that's a fair concern given the history. I think it's also important to recognize that sort of marginalization is not coming from either group. It's coming from outside forces and sources. Any regression in women's rights through a collaboration is a manipulation of children's rights. There's nothing in children's rights that is not supportive of women's rights, and vice versa. And so I think we need to be attentive to that, and we should confront those concerns. But I think it's important to recognize also that those are really an agenda pushed from the outside rather than from other groups. So that's sort of the conceptual idea. The situational conflicts, I think occasionally there will be scenarios where the rights of a woman and the rights of a child do conflict. But I think it's also important to recognize that in the vast majority of human rights issues, there is an alignment of interests. Right? When we talk about parents' rights versus children's rights, if you think about particular rights, children's health, access to healthcare, access to education, those are things that both children and parents want. Children's rights foremost are not about parental authority. They are about ensuring that children are free from abuse, neglect, oppression by the state. And the rights of parents, the rights of women, and the rights of children are aligned in the overwhelming majority of situations. Where they are not, we need a longer conversation than I can provide in the next minute. Where there are particular situations, those absolutely require thoughtful consideration with recognition of the child's best interest. But I think we should see those as exceptions in a small group of cases rather than a larger issue. The last, just to circle back very quickly, I know we'll talk about this hopefully in a couple of minutes, but when the question came up in the chat about the rights of older persons, to me, that comes back to the broader issue of how do we move from a lot of the work that's being done in human rights, women's rights, children's rights, human rights generally, which is identifying rights violations and seeking remedies, holding perpetrators accountable and seeking remedies for those who are harmed. How do we move from that post-harm role to prevention, where we don't have the harms in the first place, where we don't have the violations in the first place? And so that's where I've spent a lot of my time in the last decade, on human rights education, children's rights education. I think we'll get into that a little bit more, but looking for ways to explore how young people learn about and understand their rights and their responsibilities to respect the rights of others. And I think if we really invest in that sort of long-term project of building rights respecting communities, then that doesn't just apply to children's rights or women's rights or the rights of certain ages. It's every individual's rights. And one of the really interesting things that I'll finish on this, but one of the really interesting things about the research on human rights education is it shows very clearly that young people, children who are exposed to human rights education, develop the fundamentals of good citizenship. They link rights and responsibilities to the rights of others. And in contrast, children who do not get exposed to human rights education talk about rights as entitlements for themselves. They don't see those connections.
Yeah.
It's through human rights education that young people learn about the interconnectedness of every individual's rights. And that's how we begin to build more rights respecting communities where the violations won't occur. And I'm happy to talk about how you do that through children's literature, through the arts, which are two sort of spaces where I spend a lot of time thinking about rights education. But I'll stop and give others a chance.
All right, thank you so much. I think Terry, who is monitoring the chat, has got one question to anyone there that has
Margarita,
not answered.
I think Rangita is trying to come in first.
Oh, okay, sorry, I missed that. Go, Ranjita, sorry, go for it.
I do agree with Jonathan that there has been a historical reluctance for feminists to align their agendas with children's rights. But coming from the global South especially, but also having spent the last 30 years in academia here in the United States, I have to say that it is impossible for me to de-link women's rights from children's rights, especially when it comes to the girl child. And my own work at the intersection shows that this delinking is impossible because gender discrimination starts in childhood and as a girl. And even before birth, the devaluation of the girl child is something that plagues both agendas, whether it is the children's rights agenda or the women's rights agenda. And my own work studying some of the cultural practices really look at the ways in which children are doubly discriminated, not only because of their age, but because of their gender. And for example, the Chaupadi custom in Nepal calls for girls who are menstruating to sleep outside in huts because of the uncleanliness that is associated with periods and menstruation. So the period shaming is part of what a young girl experiences very early on in her life. The Devaki or the Kumari practice, where in South Asian countries, young girls are given to temples as goddesses, also distances girls from a normal childhood and from access to education. And then finally, the food insecurity and the resource insecurity that girls suffer from a very early age really establishes the fact that children's rights and women's rights are inextricably intertwined. And nothing speaks to that more than child marriage. And I'm going to speak of child marriage very, very quickly in terms of in the ways in which it is linked to the girl child's right to education, because I see the right to education and mandatory education for girls as being the most powerful vaccine against child marriage. And I'm going to situate the issue of child marriage in the most recent tragedy that we see unfold before us in Afghanistan. And in honoring the women and the girls of Afghanistan during this fall of Afghanistan and the takeover of the Taliban, I do want to talk about the ways in which the spike that is taking place on child marriage, the increase in child marriage, really is at the epicenter of the tragedy in Afghanistan. We are hearing stories that girls, little girls, babies as young as 20 days are being sold in their infancy as child brides because of both the economic insecurity that families are facing, but because of the uncertain future of these girls growing up without access to education, access to economic resources. And young girls who run away from forced marriage are being tried as moral crimes. So running away is criminalized in Afghanistan. And a young girl who tries to flee from a forced marriage is being tried under the Zina ordinance as someone who's being both as both a criminal offense and a moral offense. So what I want to do is to look at the ways in which access to education can be a strong, powerful vaccine against child marriage. You know, we've heard this before, but journalist Nicholas Kristof has said, and very, very powerfully, the greatest threat to extremism isn't drones firing missiles, but girls reading books. And Ban Ki-moon once said, what is it about a girl with a book that so frightens a man with a gun? So girls' education, young girls' education is not only a vaccine against child marriage, but it is the greatest threat to extremism, fundamentalism, and all forms of violence, state-led violence and non-state-led violence. So, you know, from Malala to the girls of Chibok, Malala is probably the greatest example of a girl child, a young girl being a victim because of her fierce determination to study and to access education. So she is our model of the ways in which a girl's education and a young woman who is fiercely determined to educate herself is seen as a threat to fundamentalism. The girls of Chibok are also examples of the ways in which a girl's education is often, almost often sacrificed at the altar of terrorism, fundamentalism, and tribalism. So what I would like to posit is that not only should we look at the ways in which the CEDAW and the CRC can be linked in addressing child marriage and other forms of discrimination against girls' education in a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Now more than ever, it is important that the CEDAW committee and the CRC committee come together to address the tragedy in Afghanistan. It is a tragedy against the girl child, and it is a tragedy against women. And it is important that we link them, but it's also important that we link the WPS agenda, which is the Women, Peace and Security agenda, because of the fact that these two agendas, the human rights agenda and the WPS agenda, are also inextricably interlinked. And so we have to unpack these, the WPS agenda 1325, Security Council Resolution 1325, and its progeny. There are 9 other Security Council resolutions that grew out of 1325. And I have studied the ways in which many of those Security Council resolutions address what is called conflict-related violence. So we have a new form of violence, which is conflict-related violence that impacts both the girl child as well as women, because conflict-related violence includes in its broadest reading not only sexual violence, but the kind of violence that women and girls face when they are mandatorily forced not to attend school. So when schools are closed to girls, it is a form of violence. It is a form of conflict-related violence. And an expansive reading of Security Council Resolution 1325 to include and to expand and to broaden the scope of violence to include exclusion from education for the girl child is an important ways in which we can add another tool to the arsenal of addressing the tragedy of Afghanistan.
Thank you so much. Yes, the whole new way of violence, the conflict-related violence, is pretty frightening all over the world. Now I'm going to ask Terry, because she is the person who worked with me on this program. She has a question that has not been answered that was in the chat. So Terry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, Margarita. And yes, thank you for passing. And yeah, a number of questions came up in the chat, but one that I thought might be relevant since we're talking about different treaties and tools is the question of the official connection between the Istanbul Convention and CEDAW. And this question came from Jeanette from the African Action and AIDS in the chat. So I will pose this question to Alda first and then have the other panelists weigh in. Alda, I'll repeat the question. Is there an official connection between the Istanbul Convention and CEDAW?
Thank you, Terry. Let me see if I can answer it. There is no official connection between the two conventions, but of course, any convention that protects or is trying to eliminate discrimination and violence against women comes in to the CEDAW Convention through Article 23 and 24. So the convention is, you can say it's part of, the Istanbul Convention is part of CEDAW, and you could use it even if you're not in Europe to defend women from violence in other parts of the world. So that would be my answer, but there's no official connection. Just all the treaties on human rights are related, are interrelated and interconnected, and you can use one to sort of just what Ranjita did now, like to say, well, yes, it is prohibit. The CRC does prohibit child marriage because CEDAW prohibits it, and it goes, and they're interconnected, and that is the way I would answer that question. But I would also like to take the opportunity, since I have the microphone, to say that the prohibition of child marriage does cause problems also, right? It causes, and I have meetings with I don't know in English, you say adolescent girls that are, between 15 and 18, and they're quite angry with the idea that they are not allowed to get married if they so chose, for example, 16 and over. So we have to, it's the same as the prison example that I gave. It's not like an easy solution to the situation. We know that girls that get married at a young age have a harder time in adult life, and their education is not whole always, but not always, right? There's some exceptions, and we have to find ways in which it's not. In Guatemala, for example, what they did is prohibit marriage before the age of 18, but the judge can give permission to a couple that is under 18 if they want to marry between the ages of 15 and 18. But then it's also another man, usually an adult man, that's deciding for them. So they were not happy. These my teenage girls were not happy with that solution. So I think that this has to be discussed a little more. And I just wanted to say that there are a lot of general, not a lot, but there are some general recommendations that have been the CEDAW committee and the CRC committee have done together. You know, a general recommendation / general comment, because as Jonathan was saying, the CRC calls their comments they call them general comments, and CEDAW calls them general recommendations. But they did one together, which was about harmful practices, right? Because both CEDAW and the CRC prohibit harmful practices and are calling on states to develop strategies to eliminate these harmful practices. And I think it's very important that you read it and I mean, not so that you know what it says. And because also for me, the importance more than the prohibiting the harmful practice, because they both do it in their own conventions, is that it shows how linked the CEDAW and the CRC are, and also there are some joint statements by CEDAW and the CRC, where there's one on ensuring prevention, protection, and assistance of children born of conflict and related rape and their mothers. Conflict-related rape, not and another one on Afghanistan. There's a recent, on the 11th of October, CEDAW came up with a statement on Afghanistan and urging the Taliban to honor their promises to protect women and girls, and goes into the education of girls particularly, and the child marriage also. And another statement by the CEDAW and CRC on the occasion of the International Day of the Girl Child, which also talks about the linkages between the two conventions. And then there's also joint statements by the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, and the Special Rapporteur on Violence, and the Trafficking Special Rapporteur on the day on the the 25th of November, the Day of Violence Against Women and Girls, and women of all, I would say, during their whole cycle.
Thank you, Alda. And I will ask Jonathan, and then followed by Ranjita, to weigh in on the question of the Istanbul Convention, then turn it back over to Margarita. Jonathan?
I'm happy to save the time. Alda captured all that I would have said, so I'm set on this one.
Ranjita, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yes. So the Istanbul Convention, in my opinion, really advances the values of the CEDAW. And I think, given the fact that the Istanbul Convention is a more recent normative framework, it does learn from more recent experiences what it means to address violence against women. And the ways in which the Istanbul Convention places traditional practices and names those traditional practices, including child marriage, female genital mutilation, and other forms of practices such as acid crimes, in its framework, provides us with greater ammunition. We no longer have to prove that these traditional practices constitute violence against women. And moreover, the Istanbul Convention also addresses conflict-related violence. So although, of course, the CEDAW in its General Recommendations 19 and 35 address these same forms of violence, I think having it in the Bill of Rights in the Istanbul Convention provides us the notion that these are inalienable, and they are what I call non-derogable rights. And the fact that it provides us in this foundational document, which I think is probably the crowning achievement of the women's movement, both in Europe as well as in the countries that really fought for Istanbul Convention, because it is not only the traditional European countries, but Turkey, which Turkey's identity, both as an European country, as an Asian country, as a country that absorbs the values of Islamic traditions, is key to advancing the Istanbul Convention. So I do join the women around the world who are calling upon Turkey to remain a part of the Istanbul Convention. It is really about being part of the CEDAW, because I think the CEDAW's maturity and CEDAW's call is the fact that these regional documents grow out of the CEDAW, but also expand the CEDAW.
Yeah.
So whether it is the Maputo Protocol or the Istanbul Protocol, they are about, at its best, the substance and the soul of the CEDAW.
Thank you, Ranjita, and thank you for making that connection, not only with the Istanbul Convention, but also with the others, the Maputo Protocol, for example, because it does expand CEDAW in a more present form. I'll pass it now back to Margarita.
Margarita, can I just jump in? I wasn't going to say anything, but now, like a true academic, now I have something to say. I want to make one note to build on the previous comments. I think I'm a lawyer by training, so anytime a convention, subsequent conventions are more specific, there's value in having the precise language in a treaty to be able to rely on. I also think that there's a tendency when we talk about traditional practices prejudicial to women and girls and to children, that the discussion devolves into focusing only on the global South. And I think it's particularly important to emphasize that there's plenty of tradition here in the United States, in the global North, that, and I know I'm speaking to the choir here, I mean, because this is the group that already sees this, but I think it's important that when we talk about traditional practices, that it doesn't end up being a vehicle for shifting the debate only to certain countries or only to immigrant communities in global North countries. There's plenty of structural violence against women, I'll take the United States, that is rooted in so-called tradition that needs to be addressed as well.
Thank you to make that point, because that is very, very important, that violence against women is still a worldwide health issue, and part of patriarchy is still very much so. So now I think I'm going to turn over to the whole education thing. I think we still have some time, and I put together my question is, in order to fulfill Article 42 of the CRC, state parties undertake to make the principles and provisions of the convention widely known by appropriate and active means to adults and children alike. Obviously, I think this is the only convention that actually has a direct saying that this convention needs to be broadly disseminated and taught about. And in CEDAW, I found the demand for education to combat inequalities as expressed in Article 10C is actually quite practical. The elimination of any stereotyped concept of the roles of men and women at all levels and in all forms of education by encouraging co-education and other types of education, which will help to achieve this aim, and in particular, by revision of textbooks and school programs and the adaptation of teaching methods. So I was posing the questions to the three of you. How do you see, have you seen any of these ideas incorporated in certain places, kind of concrete, and where could one push, where could one get more involved so this actually happens? So
shall we go in the same order? I'll start. I do want to say that right after CEDAW was adopted, and the first countries in my region in Latin America and the Caribbean had started ratifying, the push was mostly in the educational level. There was so much excitement around changing the textbooks and really getting girls to be able to go to school. There was so much done, and so many even games. There were games for children to learn their human rights. There was a game I remember that was like Home, the game. I guess nobody plays games anymore, but there was a game that you go with the dice and you go and you pick up a card and it tells you something. So there was a game that had the card, and it would tell you the right that the girl had, and it really was a great way to learn about CEDAW and to learn about equality, which was the most important feature of CEDAW, right? What does equality mean? What does equality mean for girls? And they were asked to think, what do you think equality means? Which for me is the most important aspect of human rights education, to think of yourself as equally valuable, either in racial terms and sexual terms, gendered, whatever, just with the value of the human person. And so that was really great. And as time went by, everybody got tired of education. I don't know, they stopped talking so much, at least in my region, there's not so much talk about that anymore. And all these new ways of teaching human rights were kind of left on the side, parked somewhere. But with the new general recommendation, well, it's not that new, but the general recommendation, the CEDAW general recommendation 36 on education, is that I think there's a new movement towards really thinking better about or more profoundly about what education means, not only for children, but for adults also. And what I just want to take the time to say one thing about the general recommendation, because it's a fantastic general recommendation. And for those of you who haven't read it, I really recommend that you read it. But it has the one thing that I love about it is that the thinking about education sort of in three paths, which is when it's equality in education, equality through education, and equality in access to it. Well, of course, I did it the other way around. It's access first, then in, and then through education. And that should be the thermos to see if education is doing its work, because you have to have access to the education, but then once in education, you have to make sure that girls and boys get understand equality and really get the education that they need. And it doesn't mean only giving the same exact education to everyone, but to make sure that the history, the social sciences, the biologies are taught thinking of the diversity in human beings. And then through education is really, this is for the one that was newer for me, the way it was conceptualized, because it says we have to see if people that are getting educated and going through education are getting better jobs, are getting better lives, or are being fulfilled in their lives, not only in jobs, but in their lives. Do they make better choices about their lives, about what they do with their marriage, with a partner, with the children, etc. So I wanted to point out those three different ways of thinking about education, which is great. And I just want to tell Jonathan, since he said that I am also a very passionate about human rights education and have worked on human rights education for many years. And unfortunately, because of the movement, you know, that in Latin America is very strong, but in Eastern Europe also about you know, against women's rights and against the gender ideology, what they call. There's a whole movement in this region to stop human rights education, because they say that human rights education is what has opened the doors to homosexuality and all kinds of horrible things that are ruining their children. So we have to, I mean, that we have to see what is the language we're going to use to combat this kind of thing. That there's in Spanish it says, "Don't mess with my children." That's what the and I guess in the Trump people there have something similar, right? But I educate my children and I decide what the children get.
Wow, thank you so much. This is quite frightening. It's kind of like the anti-science part of the rest of the world. It's awful. So I guess probably the logical person to jump in is Jonathan, right?
Sure, I'll say a few words. Look, there's always going to be resistance to human rights. People in power don't relinquish power willingly. At least most don't, right? And so we're always going to face the obstacles. But I think your point, Alda, is really important. We do need to be strategic and think about language and think about how we engage with those who are resistant. Those are really important. I have just a few points. I already talked a little bit about human rights education and children's rights education, and I think there's an important distinction because children's rights education in many ways is much more close to what young people are thinking about, and it's also overlapping, but has some distinct rights and ways in which it's distinct from human rights more generally. But I want to note something about Article 42 that Margarita mentioned. Not only is the CRC the only treaty that has this obligation to make rights widely known, which is really critical. I mean, it's really the threshold, right? If you don't know you have rights, how are you going to exercise your rights? But it's important to pay attention to the language of that. It's the obligation is to make rights widely known. That is a broader obligation than simply educate. It is an outcome. States have to make, which means that the states have to make sure that not only are they producing materials or introducing this in the schools and other spaces, but they need to ensure that it's working. What's built into the widely known mandate is that they have to evaluate and make sure that children and adults, because it's not just children knowing about children's rights, it's also adults. So I think that's really important, just the extent of the obligation. The second thing is, I think there are some good examples of human rights education. UNICEF has a rights respecting schools curriculum, a really robust program. Amnesty International has one. There are a number of countries that have made pretty good progress on that. Some have encountered resistance, of course. But Scotland is one example that I'd point to. There's a lot of really good work being done on human rights education curriculum in the schools. I also think, in addition to school-based learning, we have to be creative and go beyond just the schools. First of all, the most obvious reason is that not all young people are in school. And so we're not reaching, if all we do is do education in the schools, human rights education in the schools, we're not reaching what are often the most marginalized youth who aren't in school. Second, I think one of the things that we often do with young people, with children, is we bring them to spaces. This is where you need to be. These are the rules you need to follow, right? And I think what we need to do much more of is meeting children where they are. Where are the spaces where young people spend their time? What engages them? What are they excited about, right? And so we know young people engage with stories. So that's, I've spent a number of years exploring human rights themes in children's literature, both positive and negative. And you can expand that beyond literature to include oral storytelling traditions, right? What are the stories young people are exposed to, and what does that teach them about their rights, about the rights of others, who's represented in those stories, who's ignored and omitted from those stories? I think there's a lot that, and many young people love to read, and even pre-reading children love to be read to, right? So that's a place where they're engaged, where they're excited to learn. And I think we have to think about those spaces. I did a project, I'll just mention briefly, reading to young people, a variety of stories. So I don't know how many people are familiar with the story of Ferdinand. It eventually became a movie at Monroe Leaf, published in the 1930s. So there are lots of arguments that this was a sort of pacifist message. Franco and Hitler both banned the book, although there's also some suggestion that Monroe Leaf did not himself see it as a pacifist argument. But when we read that story to young people, anywhere from ages 5 to 15, they saw it as an identity rights book, not prompted by us. Just we read it and asked them what their reaction to it was, and without priming, and they saw it as a story about for those who don't know the story, Ferdinand the Bull grows up to be the biggest, strongest bull, but he doesn't like to fight. He just wants to sit quietly under a cork tree and smell the flowers, right? And they saw that story to be about being who, not just who you want to be, but being who you are, right? That it's about identity. And there are hundreds and hundreds of other books that, again, many positive messages, many really problematic messages. There are lots of ways in which gender-based discrimination and gendered, racialized norms get repeated in children's books, even ones published today. And so I think children's literature is a space. More broadly, I think the arts generally. The arts has been used in a lot of really dynamic ways, from the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa to freedom songs in the civil rights and in slavery, right? The arts, from music to visual arts and so on, has been used in really dynamic ways to convey human rights messages. And I think it's a place where you can engage a lot of young people. There's lots of different ways we could think. You need to be creative about how we educate young people about their rights. And I think the way we can one way to help be successful in that context is to think about meeting them where they are. And this is a long-term project, but I think this is really, it doesn't replace addressing the immediate human rights violations. Those need to be addressed, but at the same time, we also need to work on the long-term project of building rights-respecting, rights-fulfilling communities. Thank you.
So what I'm going to do is to look at the ways in which a new generation of violence against women laws are using a hybrid model. Traditionally, and the first generation of violence against women laws looked only at punishment of the perpetrator. A new generation of laws are looking at a hybrid model, both prevention of violence as well as punishment. And the prevention calls for education. The prevention of violence starts at the educational institutional level, where both boys and girls are educated on the problems of violence against women, child marriage, acid crimes, and other forms of harmful traditional practices. So my work recently has been looking at how have we started vernacularizing both the CEDAW and the CRC's values, as well as violence against women laws are looking to education and looking to primary and secondary education as a way to combat violence against women and girls. So I've looked at the corpus of laws from around the world, a new generation of laws in the last 15 years, to look at what laws include education in its provisions as a preventative tools. So one of the paradigmatic laws that come to my mind, and I'm happy to share with you the list of these laws, but the paradigmatic law has just marked its 15th anniversary. That is the Maria da Penha law in Brazil, which was one of the first laws starting 15 years ago to address the issue of prevention of violence, and to use educational institutions as an important locus in which to discuss and educate on the prevention. And that prevention element also, and the educational element together, brings to me the urgency of involving men and boys in addressing violence and discrimination against women. And we are yet to speak about the engagement of men and boys, but the engagement of men and boys is the next frontier. So I've looked at these laws that really look at both pillars, both education as well as the engagement of men and boys as a preventative tool and as a human rights tool. So since we're running out of time, I do want to end by saying that education is key to advancing the CEDAW and the CRC and the human rights framework. And we need to make sure that education is seen in ways that we can hold educational institutions accountable. Because I think monitoring what educational institutions do and measuring the progress is pivotal. What cannot be measured cannot be managed. So therefore, when we have laws that provide measures and provisions calling upon both national and private educational institutions to change curriculums, teaching methodologies, as well as pedagogical approaches to address violence, abuse, and discrimination against women and girls, we have to also empower those institutions with financial and resource allocation to ensure that they have the finances and the resources to hold themselves accountable and hold themselves responsible to a new generation of human rights advocates who can take on this charge and share the torch of human rights education as we embark on a new era that makes human rights not only inalienable, but non-negotiable. Thank you.
Well, we have learned a lot here, and there's a lot of work to be done. I don't know if you want to open it to some live interactions for about a couple of minutes. Devon, I don't know if we have anybody that wants to talk.
I'm right here, Margarita. Yeah, we have 4 minutes left. And first of all, thank you so much, Margarita. I know you worked really hard to bring these excellent panelists, and thank you, panelists. Your passion and your commitment to human rights, children's rights, women's rights is just so, so valuable and appreciated. We do have 4 minutes left. I feel like there was so much interaction in the chat. Every month I feel like there's more and more, but I'm so grateful for it because it just shows how much interest there is. So I do want to thank everyone for being here today and apologize for the early mishap, but I think we were able to convey all of the messages accurately. As we've said before, email us at info@ngocsw.org for any forum questions. We will definitely share the recording, the notes, and all the links that we shared. We will share it with all of you and on our newsletter and social media after this meeting. So Terry and Margarita, thank you both for working so well together to bring this monthly meeting. It's been fantastic. I am so grateful that we have these moments where we're all learning together, because I was thinking throughout the meeting how much we spend time organizing the forum. We don't take a break to really learn with each other. So this has been amazing. Rangita, Jonathan, and Alda, thank you again for your time. Thank you for being part of the NGO CSW family now. And people can unmute themselves. You all know I like doing that so that we can see and hear each other before we say goodbye. We are all humans and we all have rights, as we learned today.
I
Go
just
ahead.
want to say
Goodbye.
thank you to all as well.
Margarita.
Happy holidays.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Bye again.